Well, last time as we ended, we were looking at a comparison of the haciendas and plantations. And I gave you a number of characteristics of the hacienda. A bit of a review of the hacienda. The first thing is, where was it located? Was it located in the rimland or the mainland? And the answer is, of course, the mainland. And so that's one of the characteristics of the area from Mexico on southward to the area of Panama, that the hacienda was the principal land use. Now, I didn't say the only land use, but it was the principal land use and gave characteristic to this area. One of the things I mentioned was the vast lands of the hacienda. And I brought in today a statement, a printed version of one of these hacienda sizes. It says the state of Chihuahua claimed the largest hacienda in pre-revolution Mexico, the property of Luis Terrazas, a combine of 14 haciendas totaling about 5,700,000 acres. Now, that was the largest one, and it was a combine of 14, but here was a hacienda that controlled almost 6 million acres of land. The section of land is 640 acres. So you can do the multiplication. A Kansas farmer who has pretty large farmer, if he were to have 10 sections of land or 12 sections of land that he or she would be farming, would be a large farmer. Well, you take 10 times 640 and you're up to 6,000. And if you think of that, we're only here at 6,000. This is 5,700,000 acres, which gave rise to people saying, this is just too much land. But that land, even though it was farmed fairly inefficiently, was enough to produce tremendous amount of wealth for the hacienda owner. And the kind of way that they farmed it, the principal use of the hacienda was for cattle production. Not the only thing that was produced, but cattle production. And so we focus in on the mainland associated with cattle production. We commented about social prestige, that these landowners were very prestigious in terms of their economic wealth, in terms of their place in society, and that was what they were looking for. They were not dirt farmers, and they couldn't imagine getting their hands dirty. They were cattle barons in the true sense of the word. They also became the oligarchs, and this ruling and social prestige was handed down from generation to generation. Now, in this same article, it talks about some of the problems that were associated with the hacienda. It says the hacienda store symbolized the entire hacienda system, a form of control that lasted for 4 centuries, involving debt peonage, if you would, sort of like sharecropping in the United States involved debt peonage, life servitude, coercion enforced by the rural police. It was this corruption that launched Zapata and Pancho Villa on raids in the United States and precipitated the Mexican Revolution. Sort of this need to have social justice, if you will, so that the landless peasant could become a farmer in their own right. Later on, when you read about Mexico, you're going to read about the way Mexico redistributed the land, and we'll talk a little bit about this. But as we look at the hacienda, these are the characteristics of the hacienda, and the problems still exist in the rest of Middle America other than Mexico today. Land redistribution has not occurred. The plantation is associated with the rimland. And in some ways, it produced in some ways the same situation for the Caribbean. But one of the key differences to this was that it was a capitalistic system. It was outside capital being invested in a commercial system producing crops that were in great demand in Europe, but that the Europeans could not produce themselves. So it was indeed an agricultural capitalistic system, producing wealth for the shareholders, for the owners of the company, and producing goods in the area of the Caribbean, the plantation. So we have a first world institution, a core institution, a European, an American institution, a company that raised capital, would go down into the area of the Caribbean, and they would obtain land, the prime land, the best land. So that in itself was a problem for the locals. Any land that was left over was not very good because the best of land was there producing products for Americans, for Europeans, for people in the first world who enjoyed the products from this agricultural system. The capitals and the skills were imported. Capital came from outside, and the people, the managerial skills, those came from people who were educated in American universities or in European universities. And they would be stationed in the area of the Caribbean to manage these large corporate farms, if you will, the plantation. What they produced were products, as I said, that couldn't be produced in the middle latitudes. They focused on tropical products, coffee, bananas, spices, any kind of item that we might demand as a, and this is important, as a luxury good. Because in reality, when I talk about coffee, you don't have to have coffee. You may think you do, but you don't have to. Starbucks has found that out. I mean, when the times get tough, people find they don't need to pay $5.90 for a cup of coffee. It's kind of a luxury item. And as you think about bananas, it might be nice to put on your cereal, but if you miss your banana, that doesn't have a big problem in your life. And so as you think about these products, they were all associated with luxury items. I could add tobacco, other items out here, and we'll show some pictures of tobacco. They were export-oriented. In other words, the products were produced in Middle America. The initial processing, if it needed it, was done in the field. In other words, if you produce sugar cane and you wanted to get sugar from the cane, the process of putting the cane through the mills to remove the sap and cooking it down in its initial stages was done in the plantation area. But the finishing of it, the refining, would have been done in the first world. So most of it was export-oriented rather than producing a lot of, you would say, high caliber money that could be reinvested by the locals. They obtained a salary, of course, but it was only minimal. In fact, the needs of the plantation was very seasonal. And one of the characteristics was that the laborers were underemployed. They would have liked to work more, but they were hired only at the time when they needed work, and when the company didn't need work, well, they were off the payroll, so to speak. Outflow of profit, and it produced, just like in the area of the hacienda, a lot of social and political liabilities. And so you look at the area of Middle America, and one of the things that we get, and we have initially and immediately, a lot of people who are not well off looking to improve their quality of life. Now, they may do it by way of a revolution. And in some instances, they may do it by wanting to leave the country. But in all instances, they're not real happy with where they're at and the conditions that they see. And that's pretty important since the area of the Caribbean is considered to be America's political basin, according to the Monroe Doctrine. So we will continue with that idea. Just one picture here of I put this in to show you what a sugarcane field looks like. I find students often have no idea where their materials that they utilize come from. And as you look at this field, you may say it looks a lot like corn or like a grass. And it is a big stalk that has leaves on it, sort of like cane, if you went to any kind of a cane break. And what they do is, as this gets mature, they will cut it down, de-leaf it, cut it down, and then take the stalk, press out the juices, and it's the juice that then converted into the sugar. First unrefined, and then the white sugar being the refined product. So we'll end this particular introduction, and we'll go into the next one, which is the Caribbean. And we'll look at the Caribbean. Just sort of as we look at it, a review. We told you it was cosmopolitan. That means that it has a great variety of different colonial heritages. Whereas the mainland focused primarily on the Spanish, the rimland focuses on a great variety of colonial empire. And that left behind different languages, different heritages that would relate to France and England and Spain and Dutch and British and so on. The Caribbean culture, that culture of the Caribbean itself, the original culture, this was the land of the Caribs. And so when you talk about the Caribbean basin, this means it was the basin of the Carib and Arawak Indians. Now, even though that was the case, one of the things we have to remember is that the Native Americans in the Caribbean basin died off. They're no longer there. And after we say this here, we can just eliminate them from our interests as we talk about modern Caribbean. So I'm not going to spend much time on the Caribs. Europeans introduced new workers, and the predominant group that they introduced was African. And so the African culture predominates in the Caribbean. And if they're not pure African, then they're African-European mixed or mulattoes. Recall that the mulattoes characterized the Caribbean or rimland. The mestizo characterized the mainland. So we have this duality that I keep coming back to, and I certainly will be testing over this duality. So African culture predominates in terms of numbers, in terms of the way the villages are laid out in the religions, a heavy dose of African culture in the Caribbean. And as you look at the people, if you go to the area, this picture was taken in the Dominican Republic, and as you look at the individuals, you can see that blending this mulatto phenotype, but African culture. So Caribbean with African culture. Now, it's not the only culture that's found there. I want you to be aware that there is a significant amount of South Asian culture there that came in with the indentured servants, especially in the British colonies. We're not going to say much about it, but you do need to recognize that it's there. So if you go to the Caribbean and you find influences of Hinduism and South Asian culture, you wouldn't be surprised. Okay, the economy of the Caribbean, the economic characteristics. Immediately, surplus labor. And the reason there is surplus labor is that the developed world has found a substitute for sugar. Along with that, I think you should recognize that America, the U.S., puts a tariff on imported sugar to make the price here in the United States artificially high, which works against the Caribbean. This is especially true when we think of Cuba, where we have an embargo against bringing in their sugar. If that were not there, in all probability, there would be less drive to make high fructose corn syrup. We would use sucrose. But as it is now, there is a situation where they produce non-essential crops. They produce sugar, and another big crop they produce is tobacco. And if you know anything about the United States, in the last 20 years, we have been trying to wean Americans off a tobacco product because we find it dangerous to our health. So with that in mind, anybody who is involved in two of the mainstays find that they no longer have a job. So there is this surplus labor. What do you do with surplus labor? Well, right now we have a situation in the United States with the economic downturn where we have surplus labor hired by many companies, and they do what? They get them off the payroll. They become unemployed. They may be in tent cities in California or something like that that you could imagine. They're looking for betterment. The Caribbean has a lot of surplus labor. Those people are looking for betterment. This is kind of a list of characteristics that you can see for the Caribbean, a crowded situation because they had a lot of labor to start with. There was a great demand for sugarcane, brought in large amounts of labor, so it's crowded, poverty, a feeling of hopelessness, a real feeling of hopelessness and a desire to escape. Kind of like some of you have in your small Kansas town that you came from. You know, there's no employment there. You find that going back there would be kind of hopeless. You say, I don't think I want to go back there. I've got to find a better situation, and that means I'm going to go somewhere else. And I bet for most of you out there, that describes the future. In the Caribbean, the same thing. Now, we don't have crowded situations, and we may not have as much poverty as some other agricultural areas in the United States, but that escape is still there. So they turn to whatever they can turn to. And one of the big things the Caribbean had turned to is tourism. And you've probably heard a lot about Caribbean cruises. Very popular right now. But notice I put down tourism essential yet an irritant. In other words, it's essential, people have to do it, but they get irritated in their workplace. And you may say, why do you get irritated? Well, keep in mind that most of the tourism to the area of the Caribbean is done by large ocean-going vessels. People take cruises. And when they take cruises, what they're doing is sort of taking a chariot or a boat, if you will, a ship, and they're bringing along with them the first world lifestyle. Their foods are first world, their beds are first world, the entertainment is first world, everything is just like home, except for when they have a port of call. And at the port of call, the locals say, this is our chance to get something out of this tourism. Now, there may be a possibility that it's not quite that way, and you desire to go to Port Antonio in Jamaica. We wanted moonlight and magic and found it in Port Antonio. That is a sales brochure in American publications trying to get you to go to Port Antonio. And if you know anything about marketing, they are marketing with that, and they're looking to get you to go based upon this. Port Antonio, where the charms and romance of another age is set against the lush virgin beauty of Jamaica, where tall bamboo, broad-leaved banana trees grow wild beside the road, and the refined pleasures of civilization are cultivated with great care. It's a place to escape from the crowds and discover yourself in secluded villas nestled between Jamaica's majestic blue mountains and the turquoise water of the Caribbean Sea. Port Antonio, Jamaica, where part of you will remain forever. Isn't that nice? And now you have booked your stay in Port Antonio, and you're enjoying the refined pleasures of civilization. Look at that and think about it. The refined pleasures of civilization are cultivated with great care. So that's what they're doing. Now, where do you see yourself? Are you the two here? Are you these two? I think you are. I don't think you're back here. Although this gentleman is smiling, I wonder what's going through his mind. Is he saying, God, I wonder what they ate for dinner and supper? They're pretty heavy to move around this place. What do they think I am, a slave? Here I am with this stick pushing these people through the water. But of course I'll do it because I want what? I want money. Now, they don't pay me very much, but I know that if I'm good, they will tip me. Now, the people back here, of course, say, well, they're refined. This is normal. You know, I came down here because the pleasures of civilization are cultivated with great care. I don't need to tip that man. I paid for this. I paid the hotel. But the man, he probably doesn't get anything. You know, it's interesting to me, how many of you are working as a waiter or waitress or have done that? Let's see your hands. A number of you. How many of you know that in Kansas, the minimum wage up until this year is $2.50 an hour? $2.50 an hour. So when you get a meal and it comes to you, and you think about it and said, I paid for the meal, I paid for the service, and this person has taken care of you for about an hour, and the money that you paid for the meal goes not to the person delivering it, but to the person who owns the establishment. The person who delivers it says, you're going to do what? You're going to tip me. And if somebody walks out and doesn't tip, how do you feel? Uh-huh. You are what? Irritated? Maybe beyond that, especially if it was a person or a group who maybe had 4 or 5 people, they had a bunch of drinks, they had big meals, the bill comes up to $100 and they leave without giving you anything. You are beyond irritated, you're livid. So think about that when I say tourism, the irritant industry, because it's interesting when we go out to get something and we're served, we really want to think of ourselves as kings and queens. We want to think of the refined pleasures of civilization being cultivated with great care, and the locals do it. But I guarantee you, you really think they dress that way all the time? You think about that, and it's cultivated. They're trying to provide an image for you, and they're hoping to be able to get away from poverty. What else can they do? Can they raise the price of bananas? What would you do if the price of bananas went to, say, $1.90 a pound? And hopefully you know what the price of bananas is, unlike some of our presidents and so forth who don't. Hopefully you know that the price of bananas are somewhere around 49 cents a pound. Have you ever wondered why bananas are 49 cents a pound and apples are $1 a pound or more? Think about that for a moment. Why is it? The apples are produced closer to home. They don't have the transportation costs. what causes bananas to be so cheap? Because labor isn't paid very much. So every time you're eating a banana at 49 cents a pound versus an apple at $1.30 a pound, or even 98 cents a pound, you're reaping the advantages of cheaper labor. So as we think about the Caribbean, you can begin to understand why they think they might want to escape. And when we get to Mexico, you'll even understand it more. In other words, the same job they do in Mexico, if they were in the United States, would produce a lot more green stuff. And that characterizes this area where the United States is in the core, sometimes called the first world, and the periphery or the third world is right on our borders. So keep that in mind. Here's the hotel. Oh, that's pretty nice. I stayed in that hotel. Looks like first world hotel, doesn't it? It is. It is. When I was in the Caribbean, I went there for a conference. So we stayed in the conference center. I don't always do that, and I don't necessarily like to do that. I spent a month in India, close to, and we stayed right on the local economy, stayed in places that the Indians stayed in. That's really a better way to not be an irritant tourist. But I was an irritant. And when you're there and you're an irritant, what do you try to do? Well, you try to sell things to the people. I mean, the locals say, these people have money, we don't have money, we need to get money from them. And we need to do it legally. Now, if you don't want to do it legally, you can steal a purse, you can do it illegally, but they would rather do it legally, even to the point of shining shoes that don't need to be shined. But they're there constantly bombarding you, trying to sell you something, and that becomes an irritant to the tourist because they don't understand the relationship. We look at the situation in the Caribbean, a lot of forest removal, lots and lots, tremendous amounts of land erosion. Now, we're in the tropics, and we have forest removal, and I'm going to tell you they're using it domestically. It's not the kind of forest removal that you're thinking of where they have big logging and the logging operation is done by an outside force and it's shipped to the United States or China or Japan. It's not like logging operations in Indonesia or in the Amazon. They're in here and they're removing the forest and they're using it for what? You say, well, it might be construction. And it probably is to some extent, but there is a major use of it for fuel. And the fuel is not to heat their home, but a major occupation is converting the wood, small pieces of wood, into charcoal. And the charcoal is used for heating fuel in the cities. And so there's a tremendous industry between the rural countryside where they remove the tree and convert it into charcoal and then lug it down into the cities where it's sold on the street to be used to heat their food. So as we think about the tropics, a lot of this deforestation is local. Why don't they use gas? Why don't they use oil? That all costs money compared to using their local resources. So you see the removal, you see agriculture, you see a lot of land erosion in the Caribbean. Many of these islands have mountain backbones, they have a lot of rain, and if you remove the forest, it's only natural that you're going to get erosion. They have that surplus labor that we talked about. They have surplus export products. Sugarcane, nobody wants. Tobacco, nobody really wants. Rolling it up into cigars that most of you probably say, God, what a foul-smelling thing. Some of you may love cigars. If you do, keep in mind that the majority of the people think you're smoking a foul-smelling thing. But that's just the relationship, and everybody will tell you you probably shouldn't be smoking because you're destroying your lung tissue. So with that in mind, these men are producing a product that in many ways the developed world is trying to get you to not utilize. Poverty is everywhere. It's just the nature of the place. Here you can buy a fish. You know, you can see Laundry Day over on a stream. Here you can see a tap with a spigot, and you can see a 55-gallon oil drum with a piece of cloth over it. Why is that? Because they don't have water every day. They have running water irregularly. And when you get it, what do? Well, you fill up your container. Why do you put a cloth over it? What? To keep it clean and to keep something out of it. What do you suppose would love to go into that water? Pardon? What kind of animals? What's the main thing? You don't fear it as much as they do. Pardon? Mosquitoes. Because if mosquitoes go in there, then you have the potential for being bit, and malaria characteristics of the tropics. You can read about that with the Panama Canal and dealing with the problems of malaria. And so here they have it. You know, they've got this water here and potential for mosquitoes. Laundry Day out here on the rocks. How many of you women or men in here would be prepared to do your laundry the way they do it? Now, that's not that far away from the United States. Very close. This isn't that far away from the United States. The zebu, you know, the cows and the pigs down here, not that far away. All of this, these pictures were taken in the Dominican Republic. A great place to visit. Most people don't do it on the cruise ship. They take the cruise ship, have a port of call, and they go back onto their ship. Seldom do Americans really see the conditions. The main road across the island. Housing. Yeah, it's lived in. Notice the TV area. I wonder if we're shipping our old analog TVs to Jamaica. Because they haven't switched to digital. You know, as you think about it, it's a different world. You know, it's very close. But this is, notice that the bright blue color, when they paint things really bright colored. The tin roofs that rust. Here's a home that has all these beautiful trees around it, bougainvilleas and others. It's a paradise, but it's a paradise full of poverty. Up here in this area, farmer going through, plowing his field. You know what they were growing on these fields? Flowers. Anthuriums. All kinds of flowers. Why? Well, most of the men here haven't bought flowers. But if you think about the amount of labor that goes into flower production, and you want fresh cut flowers, how far away is Jamaica from the United States by air? Hours. Just hours. It's as close as another place in the U.S. And so the flowers that would be produced here are shipped to the United States and be available in Dillon's. You know, as you think about that, there is that relationship. Flowers are great, but are they a necessity? Only if you get into trouble, for most men, are they a necessity? You know, and especially people aren't thinking about eating chocolate today, flowers are much better. You know, so you think about that, and we've got this situation very close to home with all kinds of poverty. This is Haiti. This was a picture from the book. Extreme poverty. And the Haitians, of course, are willing to get into a leaky boat and go across the Florida Straits and try to get to the U.S. If they're caught, they're shipped back to Haiti. Here's another picture. You know, as you look at it, this comes from your book, but it's reality. I can tell you I've seen it. And what's really fascinating to me are the Haitian pictures. Can you note some of the pictures that I showed you with the little homes and the bougainvillea and other colorful trees around the red soil that you would have associated with the tropics? It looks like a paradise, but it's really extreme poverty. So, what are we doing about it? Well, there are some national organizations, such as the Association of Caribbean States, that try to band together to improve conditions. The United States has had the Caribbean Basin Initiative to try to take and improve the quality of life in the Caribbean, export things, jobs down there. Just to give you a thought, how many of you like illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the United States? And you say no. We're going to talk about how we deal with that. But one of the ways, if you think about immigration, we're going to go into that next time. The reason people immigrate is twofold. One is a push and one is a pull. You have push characteristics that make you dissatisfied with where you're living, and we have documented those. And then you look around you and you say, where can I go to improve my quality of life? And those are pull situations. If the pull is strong enough, you're willing to do whatever it takes to try to get there, even if it means getting into a leaky boat and possibly losing your life to go there, because your life may not be too good where it's at anyway. So some people would say, well, if you don't want them coming here, what you need to do is to improve their quality of life there. And that's why you have things such as the Caribbean Initiative, where we focus on those areas and try to improve their quality of life. Sometimes it backfires, and it doesn't work. And we're going to talk a bit about that when we look at Mexico. So I think that's the last one with the Caribbean. We'll leave that and we'll go to the area of Mexico and Central America. And we're going to focus now on the mainland portion, rather rapidly going into this rather than looking at individual countries. Mexico, the unfinished revolution. Interestingly, Mexico has had their revolution. They had it in the early 1900s. Land was redistributed. But as we all know, conditions in Mexico are not perfect. They're anything but perfect. But there is this relationship between Mexico and the United States. And part of the reason for that is that as we look right here, Mexico borders the United States. And we're going to look at that a little bit later, but right there, we'll just look at it, I guess, right now. I forgot where it was at. How long is that border? You know, I like to tell people it's about 2,000 miles. That's easy to remember. If you want to say it's about 1,900 miles, that's probably even closer. And if that allows you to remember it, fine. But if you do it by sort of 100-year cycles in the United States, we think of the area of the 1900s, the 2000s. So 1951 as a year, the border's 1,951 miles long. And it's one of the few places in the world where the first world of the United States borders a third world country. And as you think about it, there's not a major ocean between them. Not even a little ocean between them. You can walk across the border. Like you do when you go between Kansas and Nebraska, you have 1 foot in one state and 1 foot in the other. You can do that with Mexico. 1 foot in one, 1 foot in the other. It's pretty simple. Just take a step and you've moved across the border. 1,951 miles of border, right adjacent. We look at the physiography. I've got more here for Mexico than I do for a lot of them, but we kind of are more familiar with Mexico, or should be. Notice I got the Sierra Madre, the Mother Mountains. And if you look at the area of the Occidental and you look at Oriental, the Occidental refers to west, Oriental refers to east. So you have the Mother Mountains of the west and the Mother Mountains of the east. And as you look at it, here's the western one through here, and the eastern ones, as you might guess, are right there. So there's this mountain range on both sides of this inland area and this inland area is the central plateau. And if you have mountains on either side, no matter which way the wind blows, you're in the rain shadow. And so you would immediately say, I bet it's dry there. And we're going to identify that it is. So that plateau through here, fairly dry. Notice we have the Baja, and the Baja refers to lower California. To the north is Alta California, high California. So you have Baja California, lower or to the south. And as you look at this, you'll see that I have the Sea of Cortez in here. As we're looking at it in Mexico, we call it the Gulf of California. If you're in Mexico, it'll be the Sea of Cortez. Two names according to how you're looking at it. As you move further to the south, you have the Yucatan Peninsula. Right through here, many people go to the area of Cozumel and so forth, right there in the Yucatan. And you have the Bay of Campeche. The Bay of Campeche is where you find quite a bit of oil production, right through it. The focus of Mexico's oil production. And so you see that symbol for oil fields right about there. Or as you're looking over here, you can see the same thing on the map, the oil fields. So that's the physiography. Two mother mountains, central plateau, and then some of the protrusions such as Baja California, the Yucatan, and this other area, the Bay of Campeche. Notice you have the Gulf of Mexico to the north. South of the Gulf of Mexico is the Caribbean. And we were out there looking at the Caribbean today. Now we're looking at the area where it borders on the Gulf of Mexico. Pacific to the west, farther out the Atlantic to the east. As far as the climate of Mexico, the northwest is dry. Most of the border between the United States and Mexico is exceedingly dry. Borders should be in areas that are natural borders, where there's natural breaks. That's the way our founders decided that borders should be located. So as you think about it, well, although we started on the Eastern Ocean, they wanted the border to extend all the way over to the Western Ocean because oceans make good borders. As you think about rivers, and you hear about flooding in Fargo today, keep in mind that most of our rivers flow southward. And the difference between the southward flowing streams and the northward flowing streams are called height of land. Very few of our streams flow northward. And so we use that border as a natural feature, the height of land. In the south, we didn't have that, but we had a border that was a desert. And deserts are kind of places that people have trouble with. They're dangerous places, and people tend to avoid deserts. Traditionally, they avoided deserts because it's hot and it's dry, and with the dryness, there's no water. Generally, there's not many jobs in a desert. And so as we look at the northwestern area of Mexico, it was really a population void. And since the desert extended up here into the United States, it was a population void. Now things do change. And you know that in the United States with technology we can bring water to the desert. We have the Central Arizona project bringing the water of the Colorado down into Tucson. We have air conditioning that allows you to moderate the heat of the desert. All of it comes with great costs, but Americans never seem to worry about the cost. So one of the fastest growing cities in the country was Las Vegas. People are moving en masse to Tucson, to Phoenix. So we're populating our border area. Interestingly, we're going to find that Mexico is populating this desert border area as well. And we'll talk about why that's the case. There is a little bit of CFA over here on the Gulf of Mexico. And I point that out because I told you sea climates are always great climates. And so this was a major agricultural region for Mexico right through here. As you move southward, you get down into the tropics and you get into the A climates and all the issues associated with the soils of the A climate. But most Mexicans we're going to find traditionally lived right through here, right through the waste of Mexico. Very few people in the north. And so the border served the two countries very well for a very long period of time. Not quite as well today. How long is that border? 1,951 miles. That's a lot of miles to patrol, to take care of. It's better if there's nobody there. It makes it more difficult if there's people there. Okay, just some arrows showing you where the A's and the so forth. We're going to go on with that. The population of Mexico. The word transculturation. Notice I have G11. That's a term that we need to spend a little bit of time with. The United States is a country of immigrants. And the United States was settled by a small group of British settlers originally. And they established the culture in this country and the norms. And in the United States, we welcome all kinds of immigrants as long as they abided by our norms. We can say we wanted them to acculturate. In the process of assimilation, we wanted them to give up their old culture and acculturate into our culture. I think that still continues. I see a great many Americans saying, I don't care if there's immigrants here, as long as they're like us. I want them to speak our language. I want them to be like us, because that's why we're here and we set the rules and they have to abide by them. That's called acculturation. Multiculturalism doesn't quite agree with that, and some of you may have a class on multiculturalism, and that says all cultures are okay, I'm okay, you're okay, we should be a multicultural situation. It hasn't been really the history of the U.S. We haven't really been a melting pot. We've told our immigrants to acculturate. So those of you out here who are German in terms of ethnicity and heritage, you might just as well be English. You speak English, you eat English food, you're just like other people are. You've lost your culture that was German. And that's okay. That's what we've done. In Mexico, they didn't do that. In Mexico, they had transculturation. The Spanish came, the Indians were there, the two intermixed, they intermarried, and what you have in Mexico today is a blending of the two cultures. And so the people are not called Hispanics. They're called Chicanos sometime. They're called other names to deal with the fact that they're not really a Hispanic group. They are a mixture group. They're a new group. The Bronze Race, if you want to call them that, they consider themselves a blending. There was transculturation. And the culture of Mexico is a blending of the Spanish and the Indian native culture. That's kind of significant as we look at that. Transculturation. Location, I already told you, most of the people are located between Mexico City and Veracruz. Historically empty in the north. That's changing today with great implications, but that is changing. They are heavily urbanized, 75% urbanized. 75% urbanized. That means most people of Mexico live in cities. They do city jobs. They know how to function in cities. And when they come to the United States, where do you suppose they go to? To cities. So keep in mind that when we think of people in the United States from Mexico and we think of braceros and we think of agricultural laborers, that's not going to be the natural tendency for Mexicans because most of them, like you, are urbanized. important fact. Not necessarily that 75% of them are, but certainly as you look at it, that not 50%, which would be the world's average, if you go back to the first chapter, they are more than the world average urbanized. So it's an important characteristic. 112 million. How many people in the United States? 325 to 340 million people. That means right south of the border, 112 million people, one-third the population of the U.S. And the only thing separating them from us to the border, how long? 1,951 miles. Long border. Notice it says growth will stop by 2050. In other words, population will be stabilized by 2050. But that's out there a ways. Until that time, the population in Mexico is going to continue to increase. When I first came to Fort Hays, the population was increasing by about 3.5% a year, which was a tremendous growth. They brought it down to a level that is very manageable, but that population that was there 30 years ago is now reaching age 30. In other words, they're into the labor force. And as they get into the labor force, there's a tremendous pressure for employment. How do you handle all these new people who want work? I don't know if there's anybody out there graduating this year, but if you are, you're into a situation where there's no jobs. And you're going to get out of school and you're going to want a job, and you're going to expect the country to provide you with a job. These people in Mexico are reaching employable age and they want a job, but if they don't get a job, what are they going to do? What are you going to do? You know, it's a question. I don't think most of you considered that. But probably in the next 2 or 3 years, this is not going to change, and employment is going to become an issue for you. It would be great if it's the boom times, but it's not. And it's not in Mexico. It's not the boom times. So that causes a tremendous push for people to move from Mexico to go somewhere else. We're going to look a little bit more at that push, but we're going to sort of give you some slides showing some of the items that I mentioned, the transculturation. And you can see in the areas where even yet today native languages are spoken, and these are areas where transculturation hasn't occurred totally, but where you still get the native as well as the Spanish. And when you find people on the streets in Mexico and you look at them, they don't look Spanish. They don't look like they come from Spain. They look like they are a blended population. They have characteristics that look Native American as well as Hispanic. They're called what, since they're blended together racially? White and Indian blended together are called need to go back in your notes. What were they called? The white and blacks were called mulattoes, mestizos. And that's a proper term. They are mestizos. And they will tell you they're mestizos. They're not Indian. They look down upon the Indian. They are mestizos. And so most of the people of Mexico with this transculturation are a mixture of racial characteristics as well as cultural characteristics. I mentioned that the population was located here in the West. And as you look at this particular map, it shows you the population with over 5 people as you look at it, and then on down as you look at that population density, or the population numbers in this instance. Mentioning push, that is some data that's not in your book. And I took the time for another class as well as this class to put it in. And this shows productivity. And you know, productivity is the number of widgets you produce per man hour or labor hour. It could be female as well as male. And the first thing you see in this is that as you look at productivity, the Mexican laborers what? Increasing their productivity exponentially. If you were a waiter or a waitress, you'd be carrying a lot more plates, you'd be doing all kinds of additional work per hour, and you would expect to get what for it? More pay. Well, how about their pay? Pretty much flat. Wages are flat, productivity goes up. All of this differential in here, they're not getting paid for. But the key is Mexican workers know how to work. They're not lazy. They're very productive workers. And if you're an employer in the United States, do you want a productive labor or do you want a person who just sits down on the job? You want a productive worker, don't you? Let me tell you, that would attract the attention of an employer. And here you'd wonder, why haven't their wages kept pace? Maybe a social justice issue, but they haven't. And this is real world data. This isn't just, this is real world. You can see where it comes from. Here's their growth by sector, employment growth. And this is before and after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association. The North American Free Trade Association was sold in the United States with the idea that we were going to lose jobs. We're going to lose some jobs in the United States, those jobs that are old line jobs that can be done in other countries more cheaply. We won't lose education jobs. People with education will keep their job. But if you're working in the textile industry, you're going to lose that. If you're working in putting things together, we're going to lose those jobs. Where do we want them to go to? Do we want them to go overseas to China or Japan? Or do we want them to go to Mexico with the idea being that will help the Mexican economy and they won't be immigrating to the U.S.? I thought it was sold. Help Mexico. But as you look at this, what can you tell me about how much Mexico had been helped by not NAFTA? As you look at growth and you look at employment, 1984 to 1993 is shown in the black. After NAFTA is shown in the gray. Had NAFTA been good to Mexico? No. Mexico wants to renegotiate NAFTA. Americans in the U.S. want to renegotiate NAFTA. I think NAFTA is probably going to be renegotiated. It seems to me that from both parties, we're looking at a win-win situation. But one has to ask, well, why is this? What's occurred? Well, the big problem has been in agriculture. Not only 25% of the Mexicans are rural, but 25% of 100 plus million people is a lot of people. That's 25 million people. And what happened is, as you look at the growth, it dropped. And why did it drop? Because American farmers are some of the most productive farmers in the world. They are exceedingly productive. How many of you have seen the sign? Farmer produces enough food to feed himself and 100 and some other people. And you've done what? You've removed all tariffs, you've removed all barriers or an agricultural product from the U.S. going south of the border, and Mexico couldn't compete. Therefore, agricultural employment went down. Those people who are in agriculture went into the urban areas. They're looking for urban work. Unfortunately, the growth in urban work in manufacturing and services hasn't been growing as fast as it was before. Kind of like the United States. The last quarter of last year, the gross domestic product went down 6%. So you say, okay, it went down. It went down. Big deal. In the United States, if it goes down, is it a big deal? I think you know it is. You've seen the impact of it. So as you look at Mexico and you look at before and after NAFTA, there's a problem. Mexico is facing a tremendous push. As we look at agriculture and you see the employment numbers, you can see that there was a tremendous decrease.
That also be due to technological advances of us moving machinery down there?
Moving what down there? Machine?
Yeah, machinery and stuff.
No, Mexico's manufacturing, as you look at it, didn't grow.
Yeah.
It wasn't because we were moving machinery. I'll guarantee you what happened was, although we tried to move our jobs to Mexico, you people are bright. When you go to Walmart, you buy what? The cheapest product you can find for the quality that you want. And I invite you to go home and look at where it's manufactured. Look at wherever it is, look at your clothing, look at a manufactured item, look at what you get at McDonald's for the toys and the Happy Meals, whatever, and tell me what was made in Mexico. Just look at the labels and see which one said made in Mexico. And I'll be surprised if you find 2% of whatever you have in the house saying made in Mexico. Would you agree? So, yeah, that the Chinese were so much more efficient than the Mexicans at producing products at a low labor cost that Mexico still couldn't compete. We couldn't compete. Mexico couldn't compete. It's been a real problem for the Western Hemisphere. So with that, as we look at these, we can begin to understand why there's that movement northward. Now, it talks in here about the Mexican Revolution. I think that's important that you understand that Mexico had a revolution. It hadn't occurred in the rest of the Central American countries to the extent that it did in Mexico. Well, there was a revolution in Nicaragua. There's been a number of revolutions in the past. Many of them have not been successful. Many of the Central American countries would tell you the reason they weren't successful was because of outside interests who came in and prevented them from being successful. You can read in your history book what the outside interest was. I won't tell you that. You might guess since I'm not saying what it was. But they weren't successful, but Mexico's was. And they had land redistribution. Those millions of acres held by one person was divided up, and the peons were given land. And they did it by way of a communal land system. In other words, land was given to the community, not to individuals, and it was called an ejido, E-J-I-D-O. I won't say it's been real successful, and I won't say that the peasants farmed the land any better. In comparison to the U.S., it was still inefficient. We've already said that. But they did redistribute the land. But notice it said it was an unfinished revolution. Chiapas and the Zapatistas, with the revolution still going on in the south. And in many ways, Mexico's experiencing so much turmoil right now, there is a fear about the stability of Mexico. That it's kind of unfinished down there. What is the future going to be? We don't really know. But we know right now there's a lot of unhappiness, and people are wanting money. And boy, one of the easiest ways to get money is by way of contraband. And we know about that right now. If we look at the non-contraband issues, I'm not talking about marijuana here, I'm not talking about drug trafficking, I'm not talking about things that you know occupy the employment of a lot of people, but we're talking about what's actually above board. And with that, there is traditional agriculture. That's kind of a hand-to-mouth, a subsistence. Doesn't enter into the commercial scene. It's like my backyard garden. But there's all kinds of small farmers who raise enough products so they survive on it. They may have a little bit of commercial aspects, but they're pretty close to the earth. And with that, they raise corn, beans, squash, the kind of products that had been traditional with Mexico. There is a commercial sector. And in the north, because it's arid, they have to have irrigation. kind of important. The north is irrigated, the south isn't. So more irrigation in the north produces cotton and alfalfa. Cotton for textiles, alfalfa for beef. And so a couple of reasonable products. Commercial crops that Mexico is involved with, we've got coffee, a big one, oranges, sugarcane, sisal, agave. We'll talk a little bit about those. The irrigation embayments are not necessarily like our Hoover Dam. I don't want you to think of these dams as being monstrous things. Sometimes they're deep well irrigation. Sometimes they try to collect surface water. This one hadn't been very successful. Kind of like the last few months in Kansas. If you don't get rain, which we haven't had, you're not going to have much water being collected. This is a desert, mind you. But in areas where they can do subsurface irrigation, they're going to raise alfalfa, and you're going to find vast fields of alfalfa. One thing I don't have in here, besides alfalfa and cotton, they're going to raise a lot of veggies, a lot of vegetables. And those vegetables are being shipped up to the United States. And often the land is owned by American commercial interests who have land in Mexico that they farm. Part of the reason for that is with all those new houses going up in California, all those new houses going up in Arizona, Nevada, urban growth, land gets taken out of agriculture. And, during the winter when you want your produce from California, if they don't have the land and it's in homes, they go south of the border where there's land. So there is that relationship. So you might add that they do have irrigated vegetables along the border area, along with cotton and alfalfa and so forth. Farther south, they produce coffee. This is a coffee finca that I visited. A factory in the field. This is a drying operation for the coffee and the removal of the coffee berry. Here the berries are out here drying, and then they'll remove the pulp from the seeds, and it's the seeds that are roasted. Generally the roasting doesn't take place in the field area, it takes place at the market. Because the roasting releases the flavor, and once it's roasted, it begins to lose its potency. And so most of the roasting is done. For instance, Folgers is roasted in Kansas City. And if you're in Kansas City, Missouri, when they're roasting it, it permeates the whole cityscape. I can see somebody out here saying, yeah, I've smelled it in Kansas City. So it's done closer to home. Generally, just a few big coffee producing companies owning land and shipping it north or wherever it might be. Oranges, notice the orange field back here on the hill, and oranges out here being shipped further south. Sisal for twine, for binder twine. And the agave, the blue agave goes into tequila. And so if any of you are drinkers of tequila, contraband, because you're not of the right age yet to do that, I know, it comes from the sap of the agave that is fermented and distilled. Keep in mind, fermenting it will not produce tequila. You have to then distill it to get the alcohol. And there is that caterpillar that helps fertilize it, and in some of the tequila bottles they'll have a caterpillar in there, a larvae stage of a moth. That's part of the culture of this area. I was amazed at agriculture. I told you, inefficiency. I can't imagine that you could raise agave on a hill like this, and you do it with modern agriculture. Look at that farmer. I'm going to show it on this one right here. That farmer with his oxen tilling the field to plant agave. A soil scientist in the United States would just look at that and throw their hands up in disbelief. But that is Mexican agriculture. This is Mexican agriculture. This is the subsistence agriculture, where they're raising corn, beans, squash, where they're serving their local, just the local farm. petroleum. If you read about Mexico and petroleum production, you'll read that Mexico's petroleum resources have declined substantially. They had their boom during the 1970s. Today they still have petroleum, but it's not as significant as it was back then. What I wanted to mention with this is something that you need to recognize as students. There is great potential in a resource. Every one of you are not involved with petroleum, but you're involved with a resource called education. You're getting that educational resource, and you're looking at that when you graduate and maybe get your first job, or maybe not getting your first job, as saying, I've got it made. I'm going to leverage that education, and I'm going to buy something. I'm going to buy it on time. I've got it. It's big. I'm going to do it. I've been putting it off for a long time. And that's kind of like Mexico with the boom. They found petroleum. They said, we have a lot of backlogs. You could call it shovel-ready projects if you wanted to. We have a lot of backlog of projects that need to get done. We don't have any money right now, but we've got petroleum. We can go to the bank and we can borrow the money based upon that petroleum resource, and we can get it done. So you borrow large sums of money. Of course, the banker looks at the assets, it's oil, and said, man, we can loan a lot of money to them because they got all that oil, and the oil might be $80 a barrel. Then what happens? All of a sudden, things go south. Oil drops down to $8 a barrel. The asset does what? It becomes toxic. The banker says, you owe us money. You've got that asset out there. It's not worth what it was before. We need more money. Mexico says, we don't have money. Well, you borrowed the money. Well, yeah, but we borrowed it on high-value oil. We don't have any resource right now. And so borrowing went with the boom. In the 80s, it went bust. And Mexico almost had to declare bankruptcy. And the United States helped bail them out because it was too big to fail. Sound familiar? Sounds familiar, only it's a different thing now. Keep in mind as you go out into the world, you've got an asset, education. You may even have a job. And you may leverage that by borrowing, but when you lose your job, then all of a sudden that asset, as far as the bank is concerned, is toxic. And they will claim that you need to give them the money back in payment. And you say, I can't afford it, I have a job. You can get caught in that same situation that Mexico did with borrowing. From an older person, I urge you to think many, many times before you borrow based upon a potential asset. You may have to borrow, but if you do, keep it limited. And I say that because many of you have student loans. And I know many of you say, well, I'll take out another loan. It's pretty easy to get. I'll be able to pay it off when I get my college degree. I've got an asset there. You borrow on it. If you don't get the job, you're in trouble right there. So moderate borrowing. Otherwise, you'll be in this situation. And I don't know, there's probably a lot of people in Kansas that borrowed heavily on $149 a barrel oil. And the price of oil now is what? In Kansas, less than $50 a barrel. That's kind of a toxic asset if they borrowed on it. Now, they may say, yeah, but just wait a minute, it'll be higher this summer. And the banker may well hold off because it is going back up. But how high will it get? Hard to figure it all out. I think we'll end there today. We'll finish up this chapter next time and go into South America.